My brother sent me a single text, "Kids are in a CAB to your place," and then completely turned off his phone. He assumed I would be forced to open my door, take in his children without notice, and play unpaid babysitter for his weekend getaway. He thought he had trapped me into saying yes. What he didn't realize was that I had moved across the city 4 months ago, and the new tenant living at my old address happened to be an off-duty child protective services supervisor. When a taxi driver dropped two confused young children off on a stranger's doorstep with unpaid fare and an unreachable parent, that single phone call set off a chain reaction that my brother never saw coming. Welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into the full story, make sure to comment below with the city you're watching from so I can see how far our community reaches. My name is Rachel. At 34, I had spent the better part of a decade working as a senior project manager, a career that essentially required me to master the art of organization, boundary setting, and keeping chaotic situations under total control. Unfortunately, my professional skills were no match for the reckless entitlement of my older brother, Mark. Mark was 2 years older than me, but emotionally, he had stopped evolving somewhere around age 15. He lived his life with a chronic sense of privilege, relying on weaponized incompetence and the unshakable belief that the family would always be there to pick up his broken pieces. For as long as I could remember, Mark viewed me not as a sister, but as a free, on-demand childcare service for his two young children. He and his wife, Clara, would regularly drop the kids off with zero warning, using manipulative guilt trips whenever I dared to express reluctance. But after years of having my schedule hijacked, I had finally drawn a hard line in the sand. It was a rainy Saturday evening when my phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "Hey, Clara and I got last-minute tickets to an exclusive weekend retreat. Need you to watch the kids until Sunday evening. Dropping them off soon." I didn't hesitate. I typed back immediately. "No, Mark. I have plans and you didn't give me any notice. Do not bring them here. I am not available." 5 minutes later, my phone chimed again. My stomach dropped as I read his reply. "Kids are in a CAB to your place. Driver knows the address. See you Sunday." I instantly hit call, my heart hammering against my ribs, ready to scream at him for pulling such a reckless stunt. But it went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. Mark had sent the text, blocked my number, and completely powered off his phone. He had deliberately trapped me, assuming that once two confused kids showed up at my front door, my guilt would force me to take them in. He thought he had outsmarted me, but Mark had made one catastrophic mistake. What Mark didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that I hadn't lived at that address for nearly 4 months. When I moved out of my old brick rental apartment on Elm Street, I made a very deliberate decision. I updated my address with my bank, my employer, and my close friends, but I intentionally left Mark in the dark. I was tired of him showing up unannounced whenever he needed a favor or wanted to borrow money. I needed a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe without his constant chaos barging through the front door. So, as far as Mark was concerned, I was still sitting in apartment 3B. Roughly 20 minutes after Mark turned off his phone, a yellow taxi pulled up to the curb outside my old apartment building. The rain was coming down harder now. The driver put the cab in park, checked the address on his GPS, and looked back at the two small, sleepy passengers in his back seat, Mark's 7-year-old son, Leo, and 5-year-old daughter, Maya. The driver walked the two frightened children up the steps to the front porch, clutching a handwritten sticky note Mark had handed him, which read, "Drop off at Apt 3B. Sister will pay fare." He knocked loudly on the door. But my former apartment was no longer empty, nor was it occupied by a pushover sister. For months ago, a woman named Sarah had signed the lease. Sarah was 38, sharp, incredibly observant, and worked as a senior supervisor for the County Child Protective Services. When Sarah opened the door, she wasn't met by a welcoming aunt, but by two terrified, shivering children and a very frustrated taxi driver holding a meter receipt for $45. "Are you Rachel?" the driver asked, holding out the unpaid bill. Their father put them in my cab across town and said the aunt at this address would pay the fare and take the kids. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. She looked at the sticky note, then at the two young kids clutching their small backpacks in the dark, rainy night. She immediately realized the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't just a miscommunication. A parent had dumped two young children into a hired vehicle with no guaranteed adult at the destination, no paid fare, and an unreachable phone. Mark had played a game of chicken, but he had sent his kids straight into the lap of a high-ranking child welfare official. Professional protocol took over instantly for Sarah. She wasn't just a neighbor caught off guard. She was a mandated reporter with years of field experience handling vulnerable children. The first thing she did was pay the taxi driver out of her own pocket, complete with a generous tip for making sure the kids weren't left on the street. She carried Leo and Maya's damp bags inside, wrapped the shivering children in warm blankets, and brought them into her living room with hot cocoa and an animated movie to keep them calm. Once the children were settled and safe, Sarah stepped into her kitchen and went straight to work. She pulled out her phone and dialed the local police department's non-emergency line, followed by the emergency intake hotline for her own agency. "I am reporting an active child abandonment situation," Sarah stated clearly, recording the exact timeline, the cab driver's receipt, the handwritten note from Mark, and the fact that both children had been dropped at a residential address without prior confirmation of an adult presence. Within 20 minutes, two uniformed patrol officers arrived at the apartment. They attempted to call the contact number Mark had scribbled on the sticky note, but it went straight to his powered-off voicemail. They tried Clara's phone next, same result. Both parents had completely disconnected from reality, believing their children were safely dumped on my sofa while they enjoyed their party. The officers officially logged the incident as intentional child abandonment and endangerment. While processing the scene, one of the officers asked Sarah if she knew who Rachel was. Sarah remembered my name from some lingering junk mail that still occasionally arrived at the apartment. Using the old lease agreements provided by the building landlord, the officers managed to run a database check and pull up my current cell phone number. My phone rang at 10:15 p.m. When I answered and heard a police sergeant on the line, my heart nearly stopped. "Ms. Rachel?" the officer asked sternly. "We are currently at your former address on Elm Street with two minor children, Leo and Maya. Their father claimed you were taking custody of them tonight." "Officer, I haven't lived on Elm Street in 4 months," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of shock and rage. "I explicitly told my brother I know over text less than an hour ago. I had no idea he was sending them there, and I am nowhere near that building." The sergeant's tone shifted from suspicious to dead serious. "Thank you for clarifying, ma'am. That confirms what we suspected. Your brother dropped two young children at an unverified location with an unreachable phone. This is now a formal law enforcement matter." For 14 hours, Mark and Clara lived in total bliss, completely oblivious to the hurricane they had created. They drank, danced, and slept in at their mountain resort, assuming their reckless plan had worked flawlessly. It wasn't until 11 a.m. on Sunday morning that Mark finally turned his phone back on. The moment his screen lit up, it exploded with dozens of missed calls, urgent voicemails, and violent text notifications from emergency dispatch, local law enforcement, child protective services, and me. Panic finally pierced through his arrogant bubble. He listened to a voicemail from a police detective ordering him to report immediately to the precinct. When Mark and Clara rushed into the police station, expecting to throw a quick temper tantrum and collect their kids, they were met with a cold, terrifying reality. Instead of walking out with Leo and Maya, Mark was escorted into an interrogation room by two stern detectives and a child welfare caseworker. They played the audio recording of the taxi driver, presented the handwritten note, showed the official police report from Sarah's apartment, and pulled up my text logs proving I had explicitly refused to watch the kids. The evidence was irrefutable. Mark hadn't just made an innocent mistake. He had deliberately abandoned two young children at a random location with no adult oversight just so he could go to a party. The legal fallout hit him like a freight train. Mark was formally charged with misdemeanor child endangerment and reckless abandonment. The court issued an immediate emergency protection order, placing the kids in the temporary custody of Clara's sister, while Mark and Clara were subjected to mandatory, unannounced home inspections, drug screenings, and court-ordered parenting classes. Furthermore, Mark was hit with substantial legal fees, court costs, and a heavy fine for emergency response misuse. When Mark finally realized how deep in the mud he was, he tried his usual tactic, shifting the blame onto me. He blew up my phone, screaming that I was a terrible sister for letting his life fall apart. Extended family members, relatives who had spent years enabling his bad behavior, started calling me, begging me to withdraw my statement and tell the police it was all a big misunderstanding. But I stood firm. Mark did this to himself. I told them coldly. He used his own children as pawns to bully me, and he finally ran out of moves. Over the next 6 months, the dust finally began to settle, but Mark's life was forever altered. Facing the looming threat of formal trial and potential jail time, he ended up taking a plea deal. The deal required him to complete 150 hours of community service, pay thousands of dollars in legal fees and administrative fines, and remain under strict, supervised probation for a full year. Clara, horrified by the public shame and the reality of what her husband's entitled, reckless behavior had cost their family, filed for legal separation shortly after the incident. Mark went from living in a plush suburban home to renting a tiny one-bedroom basement apartment, struggling to afford his court-mandated classes while trying to regain partial custody of his children. As for me, the entire ordeal brought a profound sense of clarity and peace. Changing my address and keeping it secret had originally felt like a drastic move, but it turned out to be the exact boundary I needed to break free from decades of emotional manipulation. By refusing to rescue Mark from his own calculated trap, I allowed the real world to finally teach him the lesson our family never had the courage to deliver. Actions have irreversible consequences. Today, Leo and Maya are back in a stable environment, living primarily with their mother and getting the care and structure they truly deserve. I still see my niece and nephew during supervised family gatherings, and I make sure they know how much their aunt loves them. But as for Mark, he no longer has any control or leverage over my life. It took a rainy night, a $400 lesson in entitlement, and a very unexpected tenant to end years of manipulation, but I finally have my life back. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have tried to help your brother out after a stunt like that, or let him face the full force of the law? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the video on.